Welcome to the World Builders Anvil, episode 163. Climate is the birth and sometimes the death of cultures. So basically, if you have bad climate, you're not going to have a good day. Just saying. Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builders Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Welcome back. As always, my name is Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And as almost always, I am Michael Miller.
Michael? I thought your name was Mike.
I don't know where you read that. My birth certificate, driver's license, passport, and all of my legal documentation says Michael. So, no.
Listen, we've done almost 100 episodes together.
Not my
name.
name.
Me that I screwed up and got your name wrong for 100 episodes.
for most of them, yeah. It's a lot of them multiple times in an episode. That's absolutely true.
Well, I'll be better, Mike. Okay. No.
Let's be fair, Jeff. Could you get any better?
Well, like I like to say,
I'm not trying to say. I'm not trying to
intelligent and humble.
I'm not trying to say that you have reached a crescendo. I'm trying to say you have no potential.
Yeah. You mispronounced that word.
This is as good as you get.
Yeah, I don't think you know what that means.
You keep saying that. I don't think you know what it means. I do not think this word means what you think it means. So, hey, guys, Welcome to the show.
Welcome. This is one of the special late-night recordings of the World Builders Anvil.
It's the first time in a while.
A combined 224 hours today, and now we're going to record episodes because we love you guys.
Want to throw out a quick shout out just to everybody who's been downloading because we're on track for record downloads this month. So thanks for joining, guys. Thanks for listening.
You're completely wrong. We are way past record downloads at this point. We're approaching almost probably 30% more. I don't know, heck, maybe almost 50% more than we've ever downloaded in a month. And this is a short month. And it's the 23rd.
You know what? I hadn't even considered that. I hadn't even thought about that aspect.
Yeah, you figure it's only the 23rd. True. Today's become by far the best day we've ever had. A lot of it is from episode 161, but if we're getting new subscribers from that, I thank you. If you actually shared this out, I'm trying to figure out who you are, and I want to shake your hand.
I'd give you a hug.
Well, I won't tell you what Michael would do for episode downloads. So
that's between you and I, Jeff. I said that as that was in confidence. You're always sharing my secrets on the show, and it's kind of not fair.
But thank you very much. It's always good to see good download numbers. A little shout out to the Undercroft group as well too. Amazing bunch of people. It's a nice growing group still. Probably start trying to actually grow it here as we reach March and I launch full time doing this. But it's been an amazing for at least downloads. I think Mike and I both had a pretty rough month.
Michael.
And Michael too we had a pretty rough month outside of the show.
Yeah, but, I would say both of us. Between you had a car accident. My dad's had it rough. Yeah. Tax return season. Work's been crazy. We've both had back issues. It's been a hard February.
I'll do a Facebook Live in the group to talk about some of the stuff that's gone on beyond that. But I don't want to whine, but I do want to thank you guys because seeing the download numbers radically increase, getting huge bumps are always good. And just the constant interaction in our Facebook group. World Builders helping world builders is really what it's about. If you want to world build, if you're thinking about world building, come join the Undercroft. Michael and I are there all the time. Mike doesn't show up because he's lazy.
That's not true.
No, Mike doesn't.
Oh yeah, Mike's a scumbag. He doesn't do much work for the show. We should consider letting him go. Honestly, he's a nice guy if you can overlook his social awkwardness, but he's kind of lazy.
Yeah, but yeah, especially with episode 161, Lessons from Excalibur and King Arthur, has become in 2 weeks the most downloaded episode we've ever had, which is amazing because typically when you get subscribers, the older the episodes are, the more downloads they get. And so for it to take off the way it has been amazing. And thank you all so much. We deeply appreciate sharing our insanity with you, especially Michael's insanity. I'm kind of the sane one in the group.
It's not. I haven't set a very high bar for you. You're not. The basis of comparison here is almost a level playing field.
Well, I think too, my wife would question my ability to judge that in people. So,
yeah, I don't think that's I don't think you might. Yeah, I agree with your wife. not the most best judge on this particular subject.
Right, but let's hop into some climate. Everyone loves talking about climate change. Yay!
Huzzah! Climate change.
Okay, so right now I want people to take what they hear about climate change and put it away. We're not talking about the modern discussion of climate change. We're talking about what I consider climate, which are vast expanses of time. The thing we have to remember as humans, we have been here. If you look at the entire existence of the universe, the amount of years humans have been in what we call civilization is like a couple of seconds before midnight at the end of the year. We are a tiny, 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 tiny blip if science is right about the age of the universe. We will be here hopefully a bit longer, but climate has actually played a huge impact on civilizations. And so there are some truthful things that can come out of it. And whether or not you want to believe climate change today, that's up to you. If you want to have a discussion about it, hit me up on Facebook or Twitter. I'll talk to you about it. But the point of this is really, one, how do cultures turn into civilizations? And really, it's all about climate change. Global warming caused civilizations. There was a huge ice age, and as it started to recede, human tribes started to move out and expand. But after a while, sort of along the equator, a lot of the really rich, amazing rivers of the earth started to become very fertile. If you remember from school, you have the Fertile Crescent, which also called the Levant, which is sort of modern day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Egypt, I think is typically considered in the Fertile Crescent. And really it stretched all the way down the Nile to a place called Nubia, and maybe even all the way down into Ethiopia. Now there's also the Mediterranean basin, became a bastion shortly thereafter. The Indus River Valley was also, once again, another amazing early civilization place. And along two major rivers, the Yangtze and the Yellow River, unless that's the same river. I'm sorry, I'm brain farting on names right now, but two major rivers, one in the north and one in the south of China, basically, where the civilizations there grew up, and it largely they think, and this is going back to that idea of big history, which we talked about before, is this idea of plants started becoming prevalent. The idea of shifting from a culture that is nomadic or semi-nomadic to sitting down in one spot and starting to farm is not a natural transition. Humans' bodies are made to move. Our brains, I think, are kind of erratic because our brains are designed to always be taking in new stimulus, and when they're not, they maybe create it themselves. That's just a theory of mine, not of anyone who knows what they're talking about.
I was about to say, what's this coming from?
Yeah, let me be clear. That's just my own conjecture. But the idea was, because around some of these rivers, it was so fertile, the range of the nomads started becoming smaller and smaller as the abundance started to grow up. They started to have population issues, which caused more migration of certain people. But after a while, they started to figure out how to farm and take advantage of the abundance to sort of go from this idea of strictly a nomadic culture to farming happened because of overpopulation. And so, as the population would sort of crest out, they started figuring out different ways to sort of support the people so they didn't have to keep leaving. Because you figure in tribal societies, this is your family, this is your extended family. And so when they take off, that's like your family leaving forever, and that's how people spread across the world. But, at a point, people don't like to see their family leave, at least maybe not their extended family. So I guess it depends on what family you belong into. The more abundance there is in an area, cultures start becoming less and more sedentary. They want to move around less, because if they move on from this very good area, then they give up.
It's funny that you should mention this. I was actually watching, I think, was it Noah Trevor, the guy who's on The Daily Show now? Or Trevor Noah.
Oh, okay. I was like, that name's really familiar.
It's either Noah Trevor or Trevor Noah. I can't remember.
Those are his two names.
He's got two first names. It's easy. It's easy to make this mistake. But he was talking about migration, or not migration. He was talking about colonization. So he was talking, and he went on and on about it very, very intelligently, but also made fun of it like crazy, which was really funny. And one of the big points he made is like, you never hear about people, in a really awesome place going out to colonize other places. He's like, the British,
exactly.
The British colonized all over the place. Why? Because it's cold. It sucks up there. He's like, they had bad weather. And he's like, you don't hear about like two guys sitting on the beach in Trinidad going, what we got to do? We got to go to other countries and make them learn our culture, and we'll teach them the calypso. He's like, no, it's gorgeous there. It's beautiful. It's sunny. It's comfortable. Of course they're going to Of course they're going to sit still. And it makes a lot of sense.
And that's a very good point. Yeah. And that's the huge thing with abundance is abundance makes you move less, because, if you move away from the Fertile Crescent, very rugged terrain throughout a lot of parts of the Middle East, deserts to the south. But essentially, so it goes from this burst of abundance to nothing, or to a lot less. So, and as your population grows, it becomes harder and harder to move. Sooner or later, and different cultures figured out different crops and different ways to do it. But, you start figuring out ways of, well, how do we make more here? Because we still need more. And if you think about it, throughout time, and there are a couple really good places to look at: England and Japan, because they're islands. So, it's a little bit more difficult for them to ship food in until you have refrigeration. So the thing is, as the farming capacities peaked, populations would stagnate for centuries. They would go up a little bit, they would come down a little bit, but overall they would be flat for centuries. Someone would figure out a different way of doing farming, which would then lead to the ability for the population to go up, because what happens is, a lack of abundance causes the prices to go up, whether you're bartering or you're using money. If there isn't as much food, you're going to have to give me more value for me to give you my food. So as food becomes more abundant, you'll give food away for less and less stuff, which allows larger populations to grow up to the point where now people can go, you know what? I'm not going to farm at all. Because think about the risk there. The first person who stopped farming was a brave person, because he's saying, you know what? All of my ancestors up until me has spent all of their time gathering, growing, or hunting food. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to sit here and play in clay to make pots for people to put food into. And they're going to give me food for the pots. So it's really this abundance that creates the ability for civilizations in areas that are farmable. The more easy it is to farm, the earlier you get your civilizations. And that's another key thing. And that's the reason why you see them around rivers. Rivers give you two advantages. One, water to do irrigation. So even if it's a little bit more arid than you want it to be, if you have plenty of water, you can, if the ground is fertile, you can use the water to grow crops in a bigger area than you could without it, because you have an abundance of water. you might not want to drink it because a lot of times the water becomes polluted very early in civilizations, and it's only later on, like in the past 100 years, you would consider drinking water. Like in the U.S., it's had a little bit cleaner water, but like Europe, there's a reason why Perrier is so old in a bottled water, because the only way you would drink water in Europe 100 years ago, maybe a little bit longer at this point, was if it was bottled, because if you drank it from the river, you were going to get dysentery and probably die.
This actually reminds me a lot of the one of the other episodes we did where we were talking about the Nile and how...
Denial?
Denial. It's not just a river in Egypt.
I was going to say, I don't remember that. I won't talk about that. I have no answer
like the oldest joke. No, just the fact that the river, was it like the... I'm trying to think of you were talking about deltas, and you were talking about how...
That's where the silt spreads out, yep.
And you were also talking about how fertile the land right around the Nile was, just because you had the river, and that you also talked about how every few years it would flood and how that would impact everybody.
Every year.
Oh, is it every year? I didn't want to misstate that, because I thought I might have been thinking incorrectly.
Well, it would have been a bad year, because the way it would stay fertile was, it's such a long river, it would bring the silt from the mountains in Ethiopia, where it starts, and in that area, down along, and then when it would flood out, it would spread them over the farmland. So then they would build machines to help bring up water, to help irrigate it, to keep it wet enough to grow their crops. But yeah, no, essentially it allowed the land to be refurbished, because what happens is when you grow crops, nutrients are taken from the ground. So the plants need certain nutrients from the ground. So if you don't know how to fertilize or put those nutrients back into the ground, after a certain period of time, the ground stops producing that crop, which is why in certain other areas, like you see this in the, oh my goodness, I'm going to slaughter this. It's the Davidids. They were the original culture in India. They got pushed to the south. They were more slash and burners. So what they would do is they would slash, burn, grow crops for I don't know how long, but as the ground would become less fertile, they would stop farming there, and they were like semi-nomadic farmers. So they would go to somewhere else and start growing crops, and they would have a similar path. And over the life of a person, they would see all of the spots you keep going back to, but they'd have to do that because they didn't know how to replenish the nutrients the crops they grew needed. And so when you live in an area like a river, and this is where the Nile exceeds like Mesopotamia, is the Nile pretty much like clockwork would flood every year after the harvest. How wonderful is that? Tigris and Euphrates, not so kind. You would get random floods during your crop growing season. Sometimes certain towns would lose their entire crops, and that would help lead to war. Or you wouldn't get floods at all because it was a little bit drier year. It wasn't as consistent of flooding, and it was inconsistent really at really bad times, to where, like I said, flooding after you harvest is awesome because it refurbishes the ground. A month before you harvest means you might starve and die if you don't have food stored, but which also leads to other important things for cultures that they have to develop. How do we store food? You need pots. So how do I convince you to stop growing food and making me pots so we can grow and store the food in a granary until it's needed in case there's a bad flood or a bad harvest because a disease wipes out the crops? So that's how things start leaking out technology-wise. I think in fishing communities, there's, maybe you start with fishing line, and then someone figures out how to make a net. They can trade those nets for more fish, which makes them wealthier. In a lot of civilizations, it's when you start to see an abundance in food sources is where you start to see a developing of an aristocracy, a leadership class. As the populations grow more, they help manage the way things move. And that really is sort of the birth of modern, what they call agricultural civilizations. Your Egypt's, your Mesopotamia, your Babylon, your Assyrians. Most of what we consider civilizations are all agrarian. You have a few other ways that you can make get by, but you typically don't have the abundance to allow people to specialize to that degree.
Now, I don't want to, because I know you have the show notes out in front of you, and I am being held back by being able to read the notes right this second. Part of me wants to break into talking about how this affects what choices you're gonna make when you're creating your cultures and your landscapes, your maps, and subsequently your climates and your areas. But I also don't want to throw us off track.
Yeah, well, no, I mean that's kind of related too. So essentially, the idea is because of the chance for the abundance of water, and the secondary chance is actually going to be the secondary benefit is you could transport food easily on water. Rivers are your original roads. Before you get roads, you get rivers. And so it's another thing where we have a city here and a city up there. We can now start trading easily along the river because we can, it's easy to make things that can float and carry, essentially barges up and down rivers. It's not like across the ocean where you need stronger boats that can hold back bigger waves and bigger storms. So those are really the two things that help spur up early civilizations. So the thing is, when they're forming up, there's one other thing that becomes important too. These are the places where you can start domesticating animals. So you might have hunter-gatherers. They really didn't have the time to figure out how to domesticate animals, but when you should have an abundance, you can start domesticating certain types of animals that have that tendency a lot easier and start growing herds. And so that leads you to the ability to create two things. One, like your ranchers, which helps, and this is not mandatory. Like in North America, definitely, and I think even South America, there was not a domestication of animals that happened, and not like it did in Africa, Asia, and Europe. I'm not sure why. It just did not happen. Maybe it's a cultural thing. I've never seen anything that has convinced me of why it didn't really happen here. But because of that, though, it created a third type of possible civilization, not really civilization, but an important thing that happens called your pastoral tribes. That's your Huns, your Mongols, your Magyars, all of the great ones that have existed over time. Because once you figure out how to start domesticating animals, people who don't want to live in farms take those and they move around to grasslands where you can't do farms, and they can start doing these big herds and move their herds around. But they typically become very militarized, and they start extending trade between these pockets of agricultural societies. So trade will start to happen. Sometimes raiding will happen, and then sometimes you get the Huns or Mongols invading.
You said raiding, right?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Okay,
because these are the guys who come in on the horses. I think in Earth somewhere around, I want to say like 2000 BCE is when horse archers started to catch on really big in the steppes. But all of those steppe tribes that like the Mongols and the Huns are probably in the West the two that are the best known. Those guys struck fear, because they could come in fast. If you formed up your army to go after them, they just rode away, went back out to the steppes. What are you going to do? Good luck. And typically, none of those like big tribal confederations that we know of, that we call the Huns, that we call the Mongols, really didn't last for the length of time that the civilizations did. But when they spurred up, they would have a massive impact on everything because it allows trade and it also can destroy entire civilizations. Now, the other thing is, this also goes into climate change leads to overpopulation, which leads to more migration. So two things kind of cause migration. You have really good crops for like 100 years, and you get to a max population for your area, but then you have like 10 years of drought. Big chunks of your population will move because they're not going to die. But what happens sometimes is like in an area, say if it happens in like, say, one of the great examples of this, and we'll get to a bit more, is the Indus Valley. That whole culture disappeared forever. that happened several times in Mesoamerica. Like the Mayans specifically had a few different peak times of their existence, but it would be because of huge periods of drought would force the people out of the cities and back to a tribal life. So it's very big. But sometimes what happens is, like, there's a group called the Sea Peoples in the Mediterranean, and I'm assuming it was from this, but no one really knows for certain. But it's probably from food shortages, forced these guys by boat to come down to the Eastern Mediterranean, where the Hittites were really big and the Egyptians were really big. And the thing was, the Egyptians and Hittites knew about iron. There were even some iron tools, but they outlawed the making of iron weapons. And they did that specifically, even though they were better weapons, because they were so cheap to make. Because the bigger fear for the aristocracy was, wait, you mean peasants can own swords? That didn't seem appealing to the pharaohs or to the absolute rulers from the Hittites. So even though they knew how to do it, they never did. But now these sea peoples from a different area who use iron weapons come down because they're being forced to migrate because of a change in the climate, or possibly their area where their civilization is coming up is having bad years, so they're moving out to move somewhere else. They show up with iron weapons, and the Hittites disappear from the world forever. Egypt is put into a massive dark age and is almost gone off the world forever. So these migrations forced by climate change and then from the abundance and underabundance of food in the areas have massive effects, which also, once again, talking about those nomads, the reason why the nomads start shifting around, the first one that people really know about, I think, are called Scythians. And they were around the Black Sea area, and their tribal confederation stretched all the way out, probably to the edges of China. Much larger than the other empires. We don't know enough to know if they really had any real control beyond local warlords. We don't really know that, but they were feared. They actually invaded in, destroyed the Assyrian Empire. And it was just because they were chasing another tribe. And so they went down into the Middle East, took out the Assyrians, wiped out someone else. And a few hundred years later, that's what allowed the Persians to eat up the entire Middle East so quickly, was because these guys hung around for 20 years on their horses, and they would just ride around with their herds and horses and raiding and taking stuff. And then when the Persians got up and started going after them, they just went back up into the steppes. A few hundred years later, they disappear forever. Who knows why? But, these are all things that are driven by climate. So, this is one of the things that, as you're growing the history of your culture, if you're like me and you like the naturalized culture, the Bedrakim started, if you go back to those 3 episodes, very early on and kind of started pushing away, but it was due to pressures. And a lot of the subtext was it was changing climate that was allowing the growth of one civilization that was pushing these people who didn't want to be controlled by it away. And it forced wave after wave of migration. And that's one thing that you see that really in Africa, Asia, and Europe was a massive player, especially between Asia and Europe. Africa, there's a very little land that goes in between. So you got to be a little bit stronger because you have to break through Egypt to get into Africa. But, those steps across Central Asia, they're big. You could try and build a great wall, but you know what? It doesn't stop the Mongols from coming. Because really, as world builders, one of the things that we do is we look for these patterns. Because if you want something that's naturalistic, you just adopt the pattern. And so like what Michael was saying is like when you start tying this back to your cultures, what you need to look at is what are the types of tools they need to farm in the area. If it's very difficult to farm there, it will take longer for civilizations to grow up. Now, some people get really wrapped up in, in what the geology is. And to me, I kind of define the geology by where I put the rivers. Where rivers are softer ground. That's why the rivers formed there. I don't get too worried what type of rock is laid next to what type of rock. But the thing you have to realize is this is where your civilizations will probably start from. Now, if you don't have any of those, and also if you don't have an ice age, they could be at any major river. The reason they started near the equator was because the ocean levels were rising, or not rising. The ocean levels. But the reason they started there was because of the ice age. So it was really cold up further north, and the Earth was slowly warming. It got to a point which allowed the abundance in those areas. But to get into the last sort of the history part is because of the way that happened on Earth, where you have the slow cooling period, which allowed the civilizations to form up. Over time, that kept happening. They kept warming up. The Fertile Crescent today probably looks nothing the way it did all those years ago. And not just because of the new civilizations that are there, but because it kept heating and it kept heating. If you go to a place like Nubia now, I think I want to say Karakum was like their capital. The desert goes all the way up to the Nile there. That used to be a fertile place where civilizations thrived that rivaled Egypt for thousands of years. But, if you go there now, you see the ruins, but you don't see how they could do it because it's really turned strictly into desert. And you can play around a little bit with this too as you're developing your world with where your deserts develop. They will typically grow until they meet a barrier of mountains or water. So you can kind of play with that. But you're using this as things to force conditions. If you have an area where there's great ancient civilizations, it's because they had the ability to farm it. To have the ability to farm it, they had to have people there and abundance so that they could start creating other tools. They could start doing other things beyond just farming, because hunter-gatherers will always be living a subsistence life. And that's one of the tough things with farmers. I mean, with hunter-gatherers. And so over time, the reason why the agricultural civilizations sort of start to supersede everything is because it's an easier, safer way for people to survive. And the one thing evolution creates in us is this desire to survive. And that starts to override other things. That's the reason why we get so safe in our lives. But beyond Nubia, the Fertile Crescent is, like I said, it's, the great cedar of Lebanon. I don't know how much of it's left there anymore. Besides it being stripped out, it's just a lot drier than it used to be. You have the Mediterranean. Used to be the cradle of civilization in Europe. The reason it shifted north wasn't just because they figured out how to farm the clay in the north. That was part of it. But because the Mediterranean, as it became hotter, became less fertile. So you could no longer... you can no longer take advantage of stuff like that. So essentially, as the climate changes, it can make an area great for a while and then go away. And then the Indus Valley, I already covered that. I'll leave that one alone. So really sort of the takeaways for a world builder here is, look at the pattern and the building blocks. Those are the cues that you need to build your civilizations. Only if you're doing it naturalistically. Once again, if you're building, the land of Oz or what is that? Neverland. Those are fantastical. They don't need rationale or reasons to have things where they are. But when you want it to appear naturalistic, just look at the pattern. Abundance, food. Climate change. These are the things that force things to move around. These are the things that causes the collisions, which make great invasions happen, which destroy empires. These are the things that will shape the cultures, the rivalries between nations. It's not in your best interest to invade your neighbor if you have enough. If you have more than enough, it's not in your best interest to invade them. It's when you had more than enough and then it goes away. These, and that's why, and we've talked about this before with cultures. Think of cultures like individual people. They are with the ideal traits of what that culture believes. Make them make decisions like a person. Because in a way, big organizations act that way. Big companies act differently than any of the people inside of them want them to. Even like the kings and emperors don't get their way all of the time. The CEOs don't get everything that they want every day of the week. It just doesn't happen because they become an entity to themselves. Treat it like a character, and then climate is a major thing that you can use to slap it. So I make this area very
to slap it.
Yeah, and they're characters. So what do you do with characters? You kill them. Yeah, I think
well, you do.
But keep that in mind. Kill the characters. I mean, civilizations. Wait, that's worse, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a bit. That's a little larger. You're talking larger scale there.
Their character and beliefs form from these early interactions. So if your life is about farming, things that help you do that, things that hurt you, become the good and bad things in your civilization. And just take it, treat it like a character, and it doesn't care about any of its parts. It's like you don't know the names of any of the cells in your kidney, but when you drink that beer, you're killing them.
Sure.
But you do it because it tastes good.
Who do you think named them, Jeff? I did. Of course I know the names of all the cells in my kidneys.
You named all the ones in my kidney, though.
No, that's true. I kind of want to briefly talk about climate on a smaller scale. You're talking about major shifts in cultural development and how a people come to be based on the landscape and the weather and the whole nine. But I want to get a little more macro for a minute. And talk about
micro, you mean?
Or maybe micro, I think is what I mean. Yeah. Macro is the larger, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay. So forget I said that. In a circumstance where you just think about what the climate like is for a people. Let's take the Inuit for a minute. The Inuit eat like lard. They eat fat, because it's one of the things that is available to them. There's not a lot of plants growing up there. They hunt what's out there, and it's so cold. A lot of the animals that are out there have a lot of blubber. You, as your average person, I'm assuming the average listener is not Inuit. Let's just go with me. I couldn't survive on a diet like that. It would make me very sick.
Yeah.
But they can. They also wear dramatically different clothing than I would because of their climate. Like in one of our other episodes where we were talking about building materials for a given type of people, they're only going to have access to the given building materials. So you got to think about on the same scale with their climate, they're going to be completely affected by what's around them. You don't see people in the desert wearing, thick, heavy layers that are going to insulate heat. No, they wear very thin layers. They do wear
or nothing. Or less.
Well, they do wear clothing to protect them from the sun, of course.
It depends on where you are. Certain cultures do, certain cultures don't. If they come up with clothing that can protect them from like the sand and the heat and the light, they do. But if they don't have the materials around to do that, they go without. That's where the classic thing of the young boys with the National Geographic magazines. Because in a lot of cultures where it's very hot and they don't have the materials to make these wonderful clothes that will keep the temperature off, they go without because it makes more sense. But yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot of truth to what you're saying, it's like, and that's the thing to remember too, is when there is not enough to create abundance, trading becomes a thing of opportunity. So that, any peoples will trade. But the thing is, unless they have something of true value, beyond food, and they don't have extra, if they don't have extra, they can't trade it. They're not going to trade off just enough food. So when they get extra and they're at the right place at the right time, they will trade. If they're not able to trade, they won't. And that's where the agricultural societies become dominant societies because they manufacture their food. Much more efficiently, so they're much more likely to at most times have more abundance to be able to allow the trading to happen, which also that's why Egypt could get all of the materials to make bronze weapons. They all weren't available in Egypt, but they could trade because of the abundance of food. Because of the abundance of food, they could actually go grab out some of that, come back, and text message stuff to people. That's all right. But they could come back and with the tin they needed to mix with the copper to make the actual bronze weapons. So that's the important abundance of food is the most important thing to create the trade. And there's more to it than that, like I said, but understand the rhythms of it. People will be everywhere, that they can't exist on the planets that you create. They will adapt to those regions. When they can make them abundant, they will expand from those regions. So I think that's one of the big takeaways. Like Michael said, it's like even same cultures will modify where they are. The Romans have pretty standard layouts of homes. Even the big rich people's homes had sort of a certain number of rooms in the back, a big courtyard, big pool to hold water in that courtyard. But when you go to Roman homes built in North Africa, the living areas were all underground.
No kidding.
Yeah, but I mean, why? It was just a lot hotter there, so they put the living areas underground so they could still sleep because they weren't used to the heat. So, as they expand out, they will modify based off of those current conditions, which that is sort of invading into a new climate, which is related to climate once again. As people interact with clients, they'll take the lessons they've learned and apply it to where they are. So do you have any other wonderful information for the users this day or the listeners?
No. No, I just take into consideration the climate and how that's going to affect the people. A lot of times people will design a culture with the idea of what the culture looks like and how they're dressed and whatever, and then they'll think about where they live. It has to happen the other way around.
Yeah, think about it the other way around. That's the simplest form. And they say, keep it simple, stupid. At least that's what people keep telling me. I hope they're right because I'm very simple. So for the world building task of the day, take out one of your main cultures, wargame out the climate effects around them. And I don't mean like what got them to where they are, but say what would happen to this big, impressive empire of massiveness if all of a sudden they had trouble making food, and war game it out, what factions break apart. Are there certain groups that are more likely within the culture to just go or be forced, or is there certain groups that would force other people out? War game out the effects of either getting too hot or too cold, just basic overall weather changes. But like very long term, not like, a couple of years of it being hot or 100 years. Climate, consider at least a decade for purposes of civilizations being affected, which is much less than a real climate unit would be like 10,000 years, but that's too much because, we just haven't been around that long. So check it out, wargame it with yours. And then for the real world task, join the Undercroft group at facebook.com/groups/Undercroft and let us know what you're actually wargaming out with your climate. I know there's one guy there, John Daly, who's very obsessed with climate change, has a whole Great Lakes world, which is all based on differences in climate, if I understand it correctly. So there's a lot of interest for it in the group. And if it's just to joke around and have fun with it, that's the main thing to do when you world build. Have fun with it.
Yeah, and I don't know if we shouted out John. So John Daly, welcome to the show, man. And welcome to the Undercroft group.
Yeah, if we've not given you a shout out before, you just got one. But especially if you're obsessed with climate, he seems like a guy who really knows a lot about it. So.
Yeah, take a look at the Undercroft group. There's a real nice community that we're building there. A lot of nice people, a lot of like-minded individuals. If you're listening to the show, it really makes sense to join the group and like hang out with us. And a side benefit is you guys can interact with Jeff and I directly. Like we're right there. We check. I check it. I can't tell you how many times a day I'm on my phone quickly looking at our Facebook page.
And we appreciate being trolled at any moment.
Oh yeah, absolutely. If you think we're
If the delivery is good, though, the delivery has to be there or we'll be disappointed.
Thank you so much for listening to the World Builders Anvil. We would love it if you would share the World Builders Anvil with 2 of your friends, and so would they. If they are unfamiliar with podcasts, then you get to introduce them to the wonderful world of podcasting by showing them Stitcher or iTunes, or, best of all, just send them to our website, www.gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com.
Now strike while the mithril's hot.